Marcus's hands trembled on the steering wheel as his phone buzzed for the third time in 5 minutes. The notification glowed against the darkness of his Honda's dashboard. Interview reminder, 18 minutes. His foot pressed harder on the accelerator, the engine straining as he wove through the morning traffic on Interstate 94. The suit he'd borrowed from his cousin felt tight around his shoulders, and sweat was already forming at his collar, despite the November cold seeping through the car's failing heater. This was it, his last shot, the final interview after 6 months of rejections, after his savings had dried up, after his mother had started skipping her own medications to help with his rent. That's when he saw the old man. The silver Mercedes sat tilted on the shoulder of the highway, hazard lights blinking weakly in the gray dawn. An elderly black man, maybe 70, stood beside it in a wool coat that looked expensive even from a distance. He was bent over, struggling with something near the rear tire. Marcus's eyes flicked to his rearview mirror, then back to the road ahead. 15 cars had already passed the old man. 15 people who had somewhere more important to be. Just like Marcus did. His mother's voice echoed in his head, soft but firm, the way it always sounded when she was teaching him something she believed he needed to survive in this world. Baby, character is what you do when nobody's watching. When it costs you something, that's when it counts. Damn it, Marcus whispered, and his foot moved from the accelerator to the brake. The Honda's tires crunched on gravel as he pulled onto the shoulder. Through his windshield, he could see the old man straighten up, surprised. Marcus sat there for 5 full seconds, watching the clock on his dashboard count down his future. 16 minutes now. The interview was in downtown Chicago, still 12 miles away through morning rush hour. If he helped, he was done. Finished. Back to square one, except there was no square one anymore. There was only the eviction notice taped to his apartment door and his mother's disappointed eyes trying to hide behind her smile. He opened the car door anyway. The cold hit him like a physical force, cutting through the thin dress shirt under his suit jacket. His dress shoes, the only pair he owned without holes, slipped slightly on the icy gravel. The old man turned to face him, and Marcus caught his first clear look at the stranger he was throwing his life away for. Deep-set eyes, weathered face, salt and pepper beard trimmed neat. There was something in his posture, even bent over a flat tire, that suggested a man used to standing tall. "You need some help, sir?" Marcus called out, already knowing the answer, already feeling his interview slipping away with every word. The old man studied him for a moment, his gaze moving from Marcus's face to his suit to the nervous way he was checking his phone. "You look like you have somewhere to be, young man." "I do," Marcus admitted, because lying seemed pointless now. "But you need help more than I need to be on time." A small smile crossed the old man's face, sad and knowing. "That's kind of you, but I've already called roadside assistance. They said 45 minutes, maybe an hour with this traffic. You should go. I'll be fine." 45 minutes. Marcus's interview would be over by then. Over and given to someone else. Someone who hadn't stopped. Someone who had kept their eyes forward and their conscience quiet. He looked at the flat tire, completely deflated, the rim nearly touching the asphalt. He looked at the old man's hands, age-spotted and trembling slightly in the cold. He looked at his phone, 14 minutes. "Let me just take a look," Marcus heard himself say. The old man gestured to the tire with something like resignation, as if he'd tried to save Marcus from himself and failed. "Jack's in the trunk. I got it out, but I can't seem to get it positioned right. These old hands aren't what they used to be." Marcus popped the Mercedes trunk and found the jack, along with a lug wrench that looked like it had never been used. The spare tire sat pristine in its well, probably original to the car. As he carried the equipment to the flat tire, his phone buzzed again. He didn't need to look to know what it said. "What's your name, son?" the old man asked, leaning against the car to stay out of Marcus's way. Marcus Webb." "Harold," the old man replied. "Harold Whitman. You from Chicago, Marcus?" "South Side, born and raised." Marcus positioned the jack under the car's frame, his hands already going numb from the cold. The metal was ice against his palms. "You?" "I'm from here originally, yes. Moved away for work. Came back about 20 years ago." "What do you do, Marcus?" The question hung in the cold air between them. Marcus focused on pumping the jack, watching the Mercedes slowly rise off the ground. What did he do? What was he about to do before he'd made the stupidest decision of his life? "I'm between jobs right now," he said finally, because it was the truth, even if it didn't capture the desperation of it. "Had an interview this morning, actually." He felt Harold's eyes on him but didn't look up. The jack slipped on the first try, and Marcus had to reposition it, his suit jacket riding up, the cold biting at his wrists. A semi-truck roared past, so close the wind from it nearly knocked him over. His phone was buzzing nonstop now, probably his mother wishing him luck, probably his cousin asking how the suit fit, probably the universe trying to tell him he'd made a catastrophic mistake. "What kind of work?" Harold asked quietly. "Operations management, supply chain logistics." Marcus got the jack positioned and started pumping again, faster now, knowing it was pointless, knowing he was already late. "Got my degree 2 years ago. Been applying everywhere since." 2 years is a long time to be looking. "Yeah, well." Marcus reached for the lug wrench, attacking the first bolt with more force than necessary. Turns out a degree from a state school and no connections doesn't open as many doors as they tell you it will. The bolt wouldn't budge. Marcus threw his full weight into it, and something in his shoulder popped. The pain was sharp and immediate, but he kept pushing, because stopping would mean admitting this was all for nothing, that he'd destroyed his future to change a tire he couldn't even change. "Here," Harold said, moving forward. "Let me try something. When my son was your age, he showed me a trick. You're turning the wrong way." "I'm turning left," Marcus said, frustrated now, cold and tired and watching his dreams die on a highway shoulder. For this model, they reverse-threaded some of the lugs. Security feature. "Try the other direction." Marcus switched direction, and the bolt gave way immediately. He stared at it for a second, then looked up at Harold, who was smiling that same sad smile. "How did you know that?" Marcus asked. "I pay attention to things," Harold said simply. They worked in silence after that, Marcus removing each lug nut while Harold held them in his coat pocket so they wouldn't roll away. The flat tire was heavier than Marcus expected, and pulling it off scraped his knuckles against the wheel well, leaving blood on his borrowed shirt cuff. He didn't care anymore. He was already late, already done. Might as well finish what he'd started. The spare tire went on easier, and Marcus tightened the lugs in the star pattern his uncle had taught him when he was 16, before his uncle had died, before everything had started falling apart. His phone had stopped buzzing. That somehow felt worse than when it had been going off constantly. "What time was your interview?" Harold asked as Marcus lowered the jack. 9:30. Marcus checked his phone. 9:47. "Downtown, I'm not making it." "No," Harold agreed. "You're not." They stood there for a moment in the cold, Marcus covered in road grime and blood, Harold watching him with those deep-set eyes that seemed to see too much. A mother would be disappointed. His landlord would be unmoved. The recruiter who'd scheduled his interview would mark him as a no-show, unreliable, not worth a second chance. "Why did you stop?" Harold asked suddenly. "Really, you knew you'd be late?" Marcus looked at the old man, at this stranger he'd just sacrificed everything for, and felt something break inside his chest. "Because my mother raised me better than to leave someone stranded on the highway in November. Because I'm trying to be the kind of man who deserves success, not just the kind who gets it. Because maybe some things matter more than an interview." His voice cracked on the last word. He was 24 years old, standing on the side of a highway in a borrowed suit covered in grease, and he'd just blown his last chance at pulling himself out of the hole his life had become. All because he couldn't drive past an old man with a flat tire. Harold reached into his coat and pulled out a wallet. "Let me give you something for your trouble. For the interview you missed." "No?" The word came out harder than Marcus intended. "I didn't do this for money." "I know you didn't. That's why I'm offering." "Keep it," Marcus said, turning back to his car. "I made my choice. I'll live with it." "Marcus," Harold's voice stopped him. "What company was the interview with?" "Whitman Industries," Marcus said over his shoulder. "Operations manager position." "Why?" He didn't wait for an answer. He climbed back into his Honda, cranked the heat that didn't work, and pulled back onto the highway. In his rear-view mirror, he saw Harold standing beside his Mercedes, watching him go, one hand raised in what might have been a wave or might have been something else entirely. Marcus's phone rang as he merged into traffic. His mother. He let it go to voicemail. What was he supposed to tell her? That he'd thrown away his last chance at a real job to help a stranger? That character mattered more than rent? She'd understand, because she'd raised him to understand. But understanding wouldn't pay her medical bills or keep the lights on. He drove in circles for 20 minutes, not ready to go home, not ready to face the rest of his day, his week, his life. Finally, he pulled into a McDonald's parking lot and checked his phone. 7 missed calls, 3 from his mother, 2 from his cousin, 1 from an unknown number, 1 from the recruiter at Whitman Industries. He called the recruiter back first, rehearsing apologies he knew wouldn't matter. Marcus Webb? The woman's voice was professional, clipped. You missed your 9:30 interview this morning. I know, I'm so sorry. There was an emergency on the highway. Someone needed help, and We filled the position. Thank you for your interest in Whitman Industries. The line went dead. Marcus sat in his car in the McDonald's parking lot and put his head against the steering wheel. The sun was fully up now, bright and cold, illuminating all the ways his life was falling apart. His phone buzzed with a text from his mother. How did it go, baby? He couldn't answer. Not yet. Instead, he drove home to his studio apartment with the eviction notice on the door, climbed the 3 flights of stairs, and sat on the edge of his bed still wearing his borrowed suit, now stained with grease and blood and failure. His mother called again that evening. He finally answered. Marcus? Baby, I've been worried sick. How did the interview go? I didn't make it, Mama. Silence on the other end. Then, what happened? He told her everything. The old man, the flat tire, the choice that wasn't really a choice because she'd raised him too well to make any other decision. When he finished, there was another long silence. You did the right thing, she said finally, her voice thick with emotion. The right thing doesn't pay rent, Mama. No, but it lets you sleep at night, and it makes your mother proud, even when you think you failed. She paused. Something will come through, baby. You keep doing right, and good things will find their way to you. Marcus wanted to believe her. He wanted to live in a world where stopping to help someone didn't cost you everything. But he was 24 years old with a degree he couldn't use, skills nobody wanted, and a conscience that had just cost him his last opportunity. That night he lay in bed and stared at the ceiling, running through all the ways his life might have been different if he'd just kept driving. If he'd been the kind of person who could look away from someone in need. If he'd learned to be practical instead of principled. 3 days passed. Marcus applied to 17 more jobs, all entry-level, most of them paying barely above minimum wage. He picked up a shift at a warehouse his cousin managed, loading trucks in the cold for $12 an hour. His hands, still scraped from changing Harold's tire, bled through his work gloves. On the 4th day, his phone rang from an unknown number. He almost didn't answer. Is this Marcus Webb? The voice was familiar, calm and measured. This is Marcus. This is Harold Whitman. We met on the highway last week. Marcus sat up from where he'd been lying on his couch, exhausted from another warehouse shift. Harold, is everything okay? Is your car? The car is fine, thanks to you. I was hoping you might have time to meet me for lunch tomorrow. I'd like to thank you properly. You don't need to do that. I'd like to anyway. Say 1 o'clock at the Whitman Industries building downtown. The address is, I know where it is, Marcus interrupted, something cold sliding down his spine. That's where my interview was, the one I missed. Yes, Harold said simply. I know. The line went quiet, but Harold didn't hang up. Marcus's mind was racing, trying to connect pieces that didn't want to fit together. The expensive Mercedes, the reverse lug nuts Harold somehow knew about, the way he'd watched Marcus with those deep-set eyes that seemed to see everything. Who are you? Marcus asked quietly. Come to lunch tomorrow, Harold said. 1 o'clock. Ask for me at the front desk. He hung up before Marcus could respond. Marcus didn't sleep that night. He ran through every conversation he'd had with Harold, every detail, every moment. The old man's questions about his work, about his life, the way he tried to get Marcus to leave, to make it to his interview on time, the sad smile when Marcus had chosen to stay anyway. At 12:30 the next day, Marcus stood outside the Whitman Industries building, the same building where he'd arrived 40 minutes late for his interview, where the receptionist had looked at him with pity and told him they'd already moved on. It was a gleaming tower of glass and steel, the kind of building that housed the kind of jobs Marcus had been dreaming about since freshman year of college. The lobby was all marble and modern art. The receptionist was different from the one who'd seen him at his lowest, and she smiled warmly when he approached. "I'm here to see Harold Whitman," Marcus said, his voice steadier than he felt. Her smile brightened. "Mr. Whitman is expecting you. Top floor, office at the end of the hall. The elevator's just behind you." Marcus's legs felt unsteady as he walked to the elevator. Top floor, office at the end of the hall. He pressed the button and watched the numbers climb. 10, 15, 20, 25, 30. The doors opened onto a floor that was quieter, more refined than the busy lobby. Thick carpet absorbed his footsteps. Original artwork lined the walls. At the end of the hall, a door stood open. Harold sat behind a desk made of dark wood, wearing a suit that probably cost more than Marcus's car. The walls were covered with framed photographs, Harold shaking hands with politicians, business leaders, celebrities. Harold at ribbon-cutting ceremonies, charity events, corporate conferences. And on the wall behind him, a portrait label that made Marcus's knees weak. Harold Whitman, CEO and founder. "Please sit down, Marcus," Harold said, gesturing to the chair across from his desk. Marcus sat because his legs wouldn't hold him anymore. "You're the CEO." "I am. Of Whitman Industries?" "Yes. The company I interviewed with." "The company you were supposed to interview with," Harold corrected gently. "But you never made it to the interview." Marcus's mind was reeling. "Because I stopped to help you. You knew who I was. On the highway. You knew." Harold leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of him. "I did." "Why?" The word came out almost angry. "Why were you there? Was the flat tire even real?" "The tire was completely real, I assure you, and incredibly inconvenient." Harold's expression was serious now, all business. "Marcus, do you know how many applications we get for a single position at this company? Hundreds, sometimes thousands. Everyone has a degree. Everyone has skills. Everyone looks good on paper. So you test them," Marcus said slowly, understanding beginning to dawn. "On the highway. Not everyone. Only the finalists, the candidates who've made it through every other screening." Harold stood and walked to the window, looking out over the Chicago skyline. "I started this company 40 years ago with nothing but a loan and a belief that character matters more than credentials. I've hired Harvard graduates who couldn't be trusted with a stapler. I've hired high school dropouts who became vice presidents. Degrees tell me what you know. But character? That tells me who you are. So the flat tire was a test," Harold confirmed. "I staged it on the route to the building, early enough that candidates would face a real choice. Help me and miss their interview, or keep driving and make it on time." He turned back to Marcus. "Do you know how many people stopped to help in the 2 years I've been doing this?" Marcus shook his head. 4 out of 63 candidates." Harold's voice was soft. 63 people drove past an old man on the side of the highway. Some slowed down. A few looked conflicted. But they all made the practical choice, the smart choice. They all made it to their interviews on time. "And you hired them?" "I hired none of them," Harold said. "Because I don't want employees who are practical when it costs them nothing. I want people who are principled when it costs them everything." Marcus felt like the air had been sucked out of the room. "You could have told me. On the highway. You could have said something." "And ruined the test?" Harold shook his head. "No. You needed to make that choice believing you were giving up everything. Because that's the only way I'd know if you were the kind of person this company needs. The kind of person who does the right thing when the right thing is also the hard thing." "But I didn't get the job," Marcus said, confused now. "The recruiter called me. She said the position was filled." "It was," Harold agreed, "by someone who made it to their interview on time, Someone with an impeccable resume and perfect references. Someone who drove past me without slowing down. He walked back to his desk and picked up a folder. I fired him yesterday. He was caught falsifying expense reports. Turns out the man who couldn't spare 5 minutes to help someone in need also couldn't be trusted with the company credit card. Harold held out the folder to Marcus. The position is open again, and I'd like to offer it to you. Operations manager with a starting salary of $85,000 a year plus benefits. 6 months of paid training, mentorship program, clear advancement track. Marcus took the folder with hands that had gone numb. The number on the offer letter swam in front of his eyes. 85,000. He'd been applying for jobs that paid 30, living on warehouse shifts that paid $12 an hour. This was more money than his mother had ever made in a year. This was the kind of job that meant security, stability, a future. Why me? He whispered. Because you chose character over comfort. Because when faced with a decision between your future and someone else's immediate need, you chose the person over the position. Because your mother raised you right. Harold smiled, and this time there was no sadness in it. And because I've been in business 40 years, Marcus, and I've learned that skills can be taught, but integrity cannot. I can teach you supply chain management. I can teach you operation systems, but I cannot teach you to be the kind of man who stops on a cold highway to help a stranger. You either are that person or you aren't. And you are. Marcus stared at the offer letter, at the signature line at the bottom, at the future it represented. I thought I'd lost everything that day. You did lose something, Harold said quietly. You lost the chance to be selfish. You lost the opportunity to put yourself first. But you gained something more valuable. The knowledge that you're the kind of person who doesn't lose themselves even when everything's on the line. He gestured to the offer. That's the kind of person I want building this company with me. Marcus's hand shook as he signed the offer letter. When he looked up, Harold was extending his hand across the desk. They shook, and Marcus felt the rough calluses on the old man's palm, the strength still in his grip despite his age. Welcome to Whitman Industries, Marcus. I think you're going to do remarkable things here. Marcus left the building an hour later with a start date, a benefits package, and a future that had been dead 4 days ago. He sat in his Honda in the parking garage and called his mother. Mama? Marcus, baby, what's wrong? You sound strange. I got the job, his voice broke. The Whitman Industries job. I got it. She cried. He cried. They stayed on the phone for 20 minutes, and she kept saying, I'm so proud of you, and he kept saying, you were right, until neither of them could speak anymore. That night, Marcus drove back to the spot on the highway where he'd pulled over to help Harold. Cars rushed past in the darkness, dozens of them, hundreds maybe, all heading somewhere important, all with places to be and futures to build. He wondered how many would stop if they saw someone in need. He wondered how many would make the choice he'd made. He'd spent 4 days thinking he'd thrown his life away for nothing. 4 days believing that doing the right thing had cost him everything. But Harold had been right. He hadn't lost himself. And in the end, that was the only thing that really mattered. Marcus started his new job 3 weeks later. The learning curve was steep, the work demanding, but Harold had been true to his word about the mentorship. Once a week they had lunch, and Harold shared not just business wisdom, but life lessons. Stories about the choices he'd made, the people he'd trusted, the principles he'd built his empire on. Character compounds, Harold told him during one of those lunches, 6 months into Marcus's tenure. Like interest. Every good choice you make, every time you do the right thing, when it costs you something, it builds on itself. And eventually, it becomes who you are. Not just what you do when people are watching, but who you are when nobody sees. Marcus thought about that on his way home that evening, driving past the exact spot where he'd pulled over to help a stranger. The shoulder was empty now. No broken down cars, no old men struggling with flat tires, just asphalt and gravel, and the memory of a choice that had changed everything. He'd learned something that cold November morning, something they didn't teach in business school or put on job applications. He learned that the road to success doesn't always lead through the interview room. Sometimes it leads through a highway shoulder where an old man needs help. Sometimes it leads through the choice to be the kind of person you want to become, even when becoming that person costs you the thing you want most. Marcus pulled into his new apartment complex, the one he could finally afford, the one with heat that worked and neighbors who didn't keep him up at night. He thought about his mother, healthy now, her medical bills paid. He thought about Harold, who'd seen something in him worth testing, worth trusting. He thought about the 63 other candidates who'd driven past, who'd made it to their interviews on time, who'd chosen the practical path. And he was grateful, deeply and truly grateful, that his mother had raised him to be impractical enough to stop. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the choices you make when nobody's watching, I'd love to hear from you in the comments. Would you have stopped on that highway? What would you have done in Marcus's position? Hit that like button if you believe character still matters in a world that often rewards shortcuts. And subscribe for more stories about real integrity, real sacrifice, and the unexpected rewards that come from doing the right thing even when it costs you everything. Because maybe, just maybe, the things we give up for our principles aren't losses at all. Maybe they're investments in becoming the kind of people we were always meant to be.